Yes, I would like to introduce our moderator for this event, Dr. Joanna Flaherty. Joanna is an associate professor at the School of Education in the University of Limerick. And apologies, she also acts as the academic coordinator of the Ubuntu network. Her research experience is focused on teaching and teacher education with a particular focus on critical decision making and global citizenship education. We couldn't have hoped for a better. I couldn't have hoped for a better colleague to co-design and host and co-host this event with me. So a huge thanks to her and to all the support that Ubuntu has provided us for this event, and it's with all your help that this event is possible today. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Anya. And we're going to stick right on schedule because we're 1 minute ahead of ourselves, which is not like us. So it gives me great pleasure to kick off our research showcase this morning by introducing our first panelist, and that is Professor Karen Pashby. And I'm delighted to welcome Karen to this event today. I met Karen in person at the beautiful UNESCO headquarters last year or the year before in Paris for the Angel Conference. So we're delighted to welcome her to this event today. Karen is Professor of Global Citizenship Education and lead for research in the School of Education at Manchester Metropolitan University, and President of the Comparative International Education Society of Canada. She's also the Adjunct Professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at University of Alberta and docent in the Faculty of Educational Sciences at the University of Helsinki. The reason we're so delighted to have Karen here today is her research interests, and equally that have been funded by the Academic Agency in Finland, the British Academy, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Swedish Research Council, all draws on decolonial theory resources to examine how to engage in productive pedagogical tensions in reflexive approaches to ethical global issues in global north contexts. She has engaged in a number of projects that have involved theoretical and policy-based research, as well as participatory research with teachers in Canada, England, Finland, and Sweden. Professor Pashby publishes widely on the topic of critical global citizenship education, and her work has been drawn on by various educational organizations and non-governmental civil society organizations to support reflexive practice. So that was just a very brief introduction to Karen. And the format for today is that Karen and I are going to engage in a conversation. I'm going to pose some questions to Karen based on her contemporary research studies. And I suppose cognizant of our audience here today coming from formal, informal, and civil society organizations, we're going to try and dig into some of the impetus for that research, the methodologies used, and some of the key findings that we may be able to adopt to our own practice as well. So with that, Karen, it's lovely to have you here today, and I'm really excited to have a conversation with a number of other people listening in on our conversation.
Thanks so much for the invitation, pardon me, and good morning, everybody.
So I suppose to kick off, Karen, one of the research articles that I fell across, of the many ones you have published, was a meta-review of typologies of global citizenship education that was published in 2020 with your colleagues, Marta da Costa, Sharon Stein, and Vanessa Andrati, a number of powerhouse publishers in the area of GCE, all four of you. So I suppose I'm wondering, what was the impetus for that meta-review? What was it from either your research experience or your practice as a global education practitioner that actually spurred you to think about this is a piece of research that the field requires?
Well, and it is a bit of a mad piece of research. For a long time, we were calling it the typologies of typologies. So it's very nice after all of the work we did to try and get that written and published for you to suggest that it's of interest to this group. I think I have to go a little bit further back to when I actually first encountered global citizenship as a thought. I mean, it's kind of funny for us to think about that, right? Because now we're just kind of swimming, we're like fish in the water of global citizenship education. But for me, it was in the early 2000s. I was working at I was a high school teacher working at an American school in Brazil. And do you guys all remember back in the early 2000s, the big thing was to have mission statements? No one was challenging the colonial language back then, but anyway, that was our deal. So the school I was working at decided they wanted to have a mission statement for the school, and I was asked to join the committee. And long story short, cultivating global citizens was one of the ideas, and it did become part of the mission statement. But the idea I had never heard of before. And what was so fascinating to me was, like, after 2 years of working at that school, I'd never really heard such an engaged and challenging conversation as happened on that committee, because the school was doing service learning. So we were taking our young people to the favelas on air-conditioned buses so they could do service learning. And then there was also a sense that these were going to be the leaders of the global economy moving forward. Brazil was just on the cusp of BRICS and all of that. So there was like such an interesting conversation. So when I actually went back to Toronto and started graduate school, I kept following this up. So I think global citizenship, it's such an aspirational concept, but it's also laden with everything we've inherited. So I could go on more about that later. But anyhow, while I was doing my master's and PhD, I started to come across things like, we remember Vanessa's really big article that changed a lot of our ideas and practice, the soft versus critical, where she really called out, and back then it was the Make Poverty History. We all remember Bono. Right, remember that? So she really kind of called us out on our push to encourage young people and people of all ages, frankly, to be active global citizens without actually challenging our own privilege or recognizing the ways that our good intentions can kind of reproduce these colonial systems of power. At the same time, someone like Harriet Marshall was doing work in the UK, and she identified a similar tension between what she called global justice education. That was, Oxfam was really behind becoming, getting our young people to feel outraged about social justice issues. And then like this sort of, what she called a technical economic, like, and by the way, this will also help them to be global, leaders in the global market. And what she showed is that actually these things spun together. So if you think about some of the campaigns at the time, we were seeing, because I am a girl, like, invest in a girl going to school, because that will enable the economic development of her entire town, her family, the town, everything. And so we saw this conflation, right, of what was kind of a social justice perspective that many of us were rallying behind in comparison to a more neoliberal or economic focused. But what Vanessa was helping us to realize is, actually, in our attempt to, put forward this social justice, if we weren't careful, we were pivoting straight into that, or there wasn't like enough of reflexivity that we were actually going to change our ways of relating from what we'd inherited. So my PhD thesis kind of examined this in the Canadian context, where I looked at the conflations, very similar things going on with multicultural education and the paternal benevolence underlying it, and I was making some connections. And what I realized was, it wasn't quite as simple as, okay, we have this economic rationale that might be distracting us from a social justice rationale, which also might not be that different. So all we need to do is put some critical perspectives in there that challenge the status quo and add some reflexivity. That actually, sometimes when you look at what's actually happening in the field, none of us fit in those like so discreetly, and we're always navigating and challenging. And yeah, we actually want our students to, get jobs, but we also want them to be critical thinkers. So I'm really going quite quick here, but it's a bit of a biography. When I started doing a postdoc with Vanessa Andreotti on this huge project about internationalization in higher education, we did a literature review, and we came together as partners, and we realized that we needed a heuristic, so a way of making sense of this that could help us identify that we are in this. We're not outside of the neoliberal, liberal humanist intersection. We are promoting a more critically reflexive approach, but that's always within this context, and it can't be outside. And so that's when we created this heuristic of the triangle. So with neoliberal, liberal, and critical, and the interfaces. And I used that to analyze a bunch of policy documents at the time. But meanwhile, global citizenship education was strong in the SDGs and in 4.7. So we saw this huge amount of research and practice. And what I started to notice was people kind of saying like, oh, Lynette Schultz says there are 3 kinds of global citizenship, or Vanessa Andrade says there are 2, soft or critical. And I started to think, what's the purpose of these typologies if we just apply them and we're not also speaking back to them and it's not like an ongoing conversation? So that's the origins of the meta review.
That's brilliant, Karen. And you know, the piece that really strikes me, Karen, is not only were you and your co-authors going to the literature to say, what have previous authors said here? What have they said in terms of the way we think about and frame GCE? But even in your answer, you've given that kind of historical evolution, because even here in Ireland, we equally, and so many people on this call could attest to this better than I, we've had that historical evolution as well in terms of our focus on development education, colonial perspectives on GCE, the charity giving perspectives on GCE. So I suppose across many different sites, you've had that evolution. But the other key piece that struck me as you were speaking was how you and your co-authors actually started to position yourselves, Karen. It was not only the what you were doing and who was talking about how we were doing it, but you really started to think about yourselves within that in terms of looking at your own positionality, looking at your own privilege. So I think that's really interesting as well. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were using roughly Paulston's idea of social cartography, which is a very complicated methodology, but basically he did this huge cartography of kind of postmodern and modernist thought and thinkers. And what was useful about that from a philosophy perspective is you could see how they intersected and were different. And but what's tricky about social cartography is it looks very representational. So you can just say, that's neoliberal, that's critical, but actually the purpose is for it to be reflexive and iterative. So if you follow this typologies, the typologies paper, the meta review, we actually built on it and we found like actually there's now a neoconservative, and I'd say even since we initially published that paper, we can all see how strong that is, and it intersects really closely with neoliberal and liberal in particular ways. And we also notice this post-critical coming up where we're being challenged, and I would say those of us working in critical global citizenship education, obviously I'm biased, that's the work I've been doing, but we sometimes get pushback about we're raising too difficult things and we're creating, I think we get told a lot with a new hegemony of the critical as the best, all of these things. I actually find that those people obviously don't know us very well or our conversations, or they haven't read this paper, because we're actually recognizing that there are unintended consequences even of taking up a critical approach. And someone like Vanessa has been really important in that work, and Sharon as well. And they identify this post-critical, sometimes Vanessa calls it otherwise. And it's not like a teleological thing where you're supposed to get to the otherwise or get to the critical. The purpose is more for us to reflect about what we're doing, in what ways is what we're doing kind of strategic to get global citizenship education into a space. Perhaps we need to kind of start with a liberal humanist perspective in some context, but if we leave it there, right, and if we don't keep the reflexivity, then we're unlikely to change the relations of power that we're trying to address. So it is quite self-reflexive. Hopefully that answers your question, Trent.
Yeah, it does, Karen. And I'm conscious now we have 8 minutes left on our schedule in terms of our chat. And there's so many things I'd like to talk to you about, even in terms of when we talk about reflexivity in the space of social justice education and global citizenship education. What does that actually mean? I might leave that one hanging, because the last part I'm most interested, and especially maybe for our participants to take into the breakout rooms that will follow this piece, is In terms of those key findings that you produced in that meta review, those typologies, I wonder, can you give us an overview of what they mean in terms of GCE application in practical terms? So if you're talking about like a neoliberal perspective, what does that mean, Karen? Or if you're talking about a post-critical perspective, because in education and particularly in research, we love language and we love complex, rich language, but sometimes it lacks that actual descriptive, practical application piece. So I'm wondering, can you help us all in terms of when you framed those 3 or 4 typologies, what do they actually mean in reality?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's lots of ways you can break it down. I think Vanessa's original soft versus critical was quite helpful, where she identified that critical is really specifically challenging the status quo. So taking that, and that way it's reflexive because it doesn't take the status quo for granted, right? Whereas in a liberal humanist perspective, it's really motivated by good intentions, this is not what's good and bad, but our good intentions without recognizing how we're positioned within these conversations can likely reproduce the systems of power and the way we relate to those who are seen as quite other from us. And then the neoliberal is this, now it's just become so normalized, but this idea that we basically can't get anything done unless we can make an economic rationale for it. And learning has become, Piazza calls it learnification, right? It's like we have to commodify learning in a particular way to show, and it's not just in learning, right? That example of the Because I Am a Girl campaign, which I think did a lot of good. So this is where the typology is interesting, right? Because it's not about good and bad, but for all of the work it got to bring attention to the need for us to get young women into schools around the world, it also reproduced this idea that young women's education is only valuable if it has an economic driver behind it. So those are kind of those 3. And then the post-critical is really messy and difficult. It's what we can't see often from our current worldview, and it might be outside of our ontology. There might be indigenous ontologies that might have something for us to say about it, but what's tricky about it is that it isn't something we can articulate in a nice concrete way because it's so different and other than the ways that we currently relate. So hopefully that helps.
It does indeed. And I suppose, it gives a really interesting framing for, I suppose, the decisions and discernments we make as global citizenship educators in terms of our entry points into our practice, which I think is really interesting. And sometimes we don't often get the time to think about that. I love the way that you've drawn on Biesta in terms of learnification. And I suppose we could even pull the string a bit more there, Karen, and look at Biesta's notion of subjectification, because wherever our learners are situated and they are having, experiences of GCE, we have to, I suppose, pause and take account for, we are creating that subjectification kind of vessel and vacuum with regards to the decisions we make in terms of the entry points we use for GCE.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think what's really tricky for us, because we're all cut from a similar cloth that are in this work, right? We are well-intended. We could have done lots of things in our careers, but we want to, I think, change the world. I mean, that's what we're motivated by. So it's very difficult for us sometimes because we feel like we have such a battle against, what's happening in the world, and there's so much that needs to be done to change it. And so it's difficult for us then to step out of our own good intentions, right? To recognize our own complicity in things. But to me, that's a dynamic space. So when I talk about dynamic tensions, it's like, let's identify what those tensions are in this particular case, or this particular group of students, or this person I'm interacting in with this project we're working on, or even my own, listening to the news and how I'm interacting with it. And what if those tensions are locking down, it's one way or the other, but most of them are dynamic, right? Most of them is even naming the tension, even articulating the challenge and how difficult it is creates an opening. And I guess what I'll end on is for me, those are pedagogical possibilities. And okay, I might be naive, so let's talk about it in the bigger rooms, but sometimes we get really locked politically, and that's understandable. I wouldn't want to be a politician today. There are a lot of really difficult decisions to be made. And sometimes I think in pedagogy, we have the possibilities, right? Because we can unpack, we can use these terminologies if they're useful or not to help us think differently. And we can create those reflexive spaces. And that's what motivates me, even though I recognize how hard the work is.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Karen. And also, I love that idea you have of those dynamic tensions being pedagogical possibilities, because even going back to the very impetus for that meta review of typologies, when you tracked your own educational history and your own educational experiences, there is that piece around, you know, and I think of Eilish Dillon's work always in this space where she talks about the homogeneity of global citizenship educators, and that sometimes we may not have access to our own blind spots. And I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I hope our participants have taken some hooks from what you've chatted to me very briefly about, that they can take and explore further in the breakout rooms. Anya, just one other piece of housekeeping that I forgot to introduce before I introduce Karen is I'm delighted to also have Leo O'Donoghue on the call today, who is a graphic harvester, who's going to take some of the thoughts, ideas, challenges, questions our participants have today and illustrate them graphically as well. We have an intense program for an online event, but of course we're very interested in having you hear a number of voices and not just ours. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next 40-minute slot. For this slot, we designed it in a Pechakucha style. We have 4 wonderful speakers who are going to share a very brief snapshot of their research endeavors with you. So in Pechakucha style, each presenter will have 5 slides and 5 minutes. I would encourage you, if you have any question that you would like to pose to any of our speakers, type their name into the chat and put in your comment or question, and we should have some time for that as well. Each presenter will will introduce themselves as they speak. And I want to maybe just outline that the input reflects a focus on one element of their research, not the totality of their research project. So when we briefed each of our speakers, we asked them maybe to select a part of their research that really hooked their interest or that they wanted to share, and they had complete autonomy in that. And we also encouraged each of our presenters to include links to their broader research study in their slides, which will all be circulated post this event as part of your resources for the event. And I just want to encourage you then to input your comments or questions in the chat as well. So we're going to kick off straight away. Presenters, I'm going to be very strict on your time, just to ensure that we can maybe facilitate some questions and comments as well at the end of this session. So I'm going to kick off and invite Maximiliana to share her content. So if you want to share your slides, Maximiliana.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Maximiliana, and I am so privileged today because I am affiliated with both the Ubuntu and in the University of Limerick and IDEA. So my research topic, my area of focus is enhancing understanding of global citizenship education within initial teachers education. And one area that I've chosen, a very small segment of my research that I've chosen, is teachers. So I'm going to focus on teachers. And I know also I won't be able to cover all things teachers, but just a snapshot of teachers for today. So with my relationship with teachers, I must say I have like maybe 28 years experience with teachers, not as a teacher or as a student teacher or anything, but as a student, you know, because I've been a student since I was 4 years old. I was following my brother to kindergarten, and my mom was very kind enough to let me go with my brother. So I started having, I started seeing teachers in class since at the age of 4. And up until now that I'm a university student, I also have 3 lovely professors that my supervisors for my research. So with my experience as a student, I have seen their teaching style, I've seen their interaction with students, and also I have seen their personal characteristics. So I'm able to say some of teachers have been my role models, and I have been interested with some of the teaching styles that they use. But just a quick question to everyone, that what is your best memory of your teacher? Because I believe everyone has been a student in one way or another. So I suppose everyone would have their best memory of their teacher, and maybe you can put it on the chat if you have time, or maybe you can just hold on that question for yourself. Like, my best memory of with my teacher would be them teaching us maybe about history, and there I was very interested to know where we came from and where we are going in terms of like a society and our roots as human. So another question that is I put 3 curious questions within the context of a teacher is, how did your teacher inspire you to think about the global issue? So if there is any time that your teacher has inspired you to think about global issue, you can also put it in the chat, or maybe you can hold on. And also, can you think of a time when your teacher talked about something happening in another part of the world? And the third question, that is a curious question, is that what global issue did your teacher help you understand better? So if there is a global issue that you understood from your teacher, that will also be fantastic. But then in reality, we also have some worst memories of our teachers as well, because if we have the best memory, unfortunately, sometimes we have the worst memories with teacher. Yeah, because we use a lot of time. We spend a lot of time with teachers as students, and so we don't get lucky all the time. I also have my worst experience with teachers. Maybe you could share it another time because of time, but then you can also put it in the chat box. So that's the video is about a boy who was punished because of being late, but it turned out that this boy had a variety of challenges, including he was taking care of his old grandma, and he came to realize that later on, and then it was like sad, and it was a learning lesson. It was a learning curve for the teacher to realize that, okay, maybe I can do some more research about my student, and then getting to understand each and every one of my students. So it's good that you say that I'll be sharing the link so that everyone can check it out and learn about sometimes how our relationship with teachers can affect our lives in one way or another. And that can also pose a question to say, if every teacher would understand their student more, it means it's better for the students to also understand their teacher more, even to understand the context of what your teacher is teaching you, because they shape our relationship with the society as well. Because up until now, I still have relationship with my teachers from primary school and also secondary school, and I maintain relationship with some teachers from the university as well. And the relationship that I'm maintaining is the ones that were positive. But if the teacher was a bit challenging, it's hard to maintain that relationship. So that is to say, if the teachers, the relationship we had with our teachers had an element of GC, it would have been easy for us students to understand more. Yeah, so I think that's the end of my presentation, and I hope we can learn more from other speakers.
Thank you so much, Maximiliana. I will now invite Gertrude on the call, and I think Anya is going to share her slides. And thank you, Maximiliana, for getting us to consider both teacher personal characteristics and traits, and also our own relationships with our teachers and educators. So I invite Gertrude.
Hi there. Hi, I've been having a lot of problems with the internet today, so I'm on my phone, and Anya is very kindly going to share these slides. If you could put them on the other.
Can everyone see the slides now?
Yeah.
The presenter view, Anya. Yeah.
Presenter view, yeah.
No problem.
Okay. So thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here as well. I think it's really important to give focus to research, and I suppose I'd like to see more of it, so I'm delighted. And it's an honor to be here. I suppose Anya gave me 5 minutes. So we've been doing the research on this for about 7 years. So I thought, what could I say in 5 minutes? And I decided to look at a topic called Silences and Hope in Global Citizenship and Development Education Research. And we've touched on this earlier anyway. So, we are working as we're doing research in third level education. I've been doing research under the Praxis Project in UCC for about 7 years. And we've been looking really at the integration of global citizenship and development education across the university, outside of teacher education, actually. And we are, I work a lot with staff, so we've had a very bottom-up kind of approach with staff, and also have consulted and worked with 1,000 students on this piece of research. So these are just some very, very small thoughts on that just struck me as something I could share today. So as I said, we are, on the one hand, and we discussed this earlier, on the one hand, talking about critical education, and on the other hand, we're in a system that's perpetuating a kind of a framework which perpetuates kind of silences. And these silences can limit the potential of global citizenship and development education as a transformative force. So my question then is, whose voices are missing and which perspectives are marginalized and why? So you can go to the next slide there. Thanks. So obviously the first that is missing, and this would be really more things that have emerged for us in our bottom up, in our own little world, but I'm sure these are probably issues that are coming up for others as well. But it's very much based on what the interests of our community of Praxis has been. So this is definitely something that's very strong. Epistemologies are basically knowledges from Indigenous and Global South. Obviously, the kind of dominance, I don't want to say complete dominance of Eurocentric paradigms, because our work is very strongly based on Paulo Freire as well. So, but at the same time, I think that Global South epistemologies are not, as a sector, we're very conscious. But in the reality of doing it, it can be just very, very challenging. And, we can only kind of take baby steps sometimes, although it is a lot easier than it used to be. And I'm not talking necessarily just about, voices in a classroom or something, or in research, but it's at all levels. All you have to do is look at the COP negotiations over the last while there, and the views of the the Global South, as they were using that terminology themselves. And in a way, it struck me, I wonder, actually, it was one time I actually thought, well, if people are using Global South, they're using it because they're distinguishing between who's paying and who's not paying. So it kind of felt more powerful when I heard it last night, that terminology, even though I don't like to use it usually. But anyway, the point is, one of the frames that's happening is that one of the things that's happening, and an example I'm giving, is framing partnerships, for example, as capacity building. This came out very strongly. This kind of what I think Karen called earlier paternal benevolence. I'm delighted now to have that word, because I'd forgotten it, that phrase, because I've been using white saviorism. And that's come out very, very strongly in our research. So I'm trying to be positive here. So we have, having looked at things that matter to us as a community, we are going to try and build reciprocal partnerships. It's a very slow process, and we are working now with 4 different countries, and we're actually now looking at the idea of partnership. We're having partnerships with 4 different countries and different kind of types of partnerships, but we're really going to try and get into the depth of what that is. So we want to center Indigenous knowledge systems in that process. The other, which we've talked about earlier as well, the other silence, number 2, is, I suppose, the critique of neoliberal landscapes. I mean, there's definitely, I mean, we're all working in different spaces, but I mean, there are different communities within those spaces, and there are some people who are going to be using words like activism and social justice and critical pedagogy, and an awful lot of people who just think these are almost dirty words. And we need to make this, we need to change that. We're marginalized sometimes. They can, in the bigger frame of things, this can be seen as very controversial, this kind of approach. It's a market, the institutions we're working in are often market orientated. That doesn't mean there aren't spaces, but it's, you know, GCE is framed as apolitical, avoiding systematic critique when that's exactly what's needed. We really saw that when the students were out on their encampment in UCC and elsewhere during the summer about Palestine. So I suppose, and I spoke earlier in the group, in the chat, that, you know, this is slow work. And if we're going to be authentic and if we're going to do it properly, it has to be slow work. It's not going to happen fast. And there's no point with all the kind of, you know, deadlines and everything else we have. It's not going to be perfect. We have really tried to be authentic, and it's beginning to pay off 7 years later. The kind of bottom-up efforts to normalize this kind of language, to build coalitions, to push for institutional change, to find the spaces and to come together to do so. And also, I think, linking research to real-world social justice actions. A lot of academics don't do that. And if you're working across a university where there's all sorts of people from all different disciplines, instigating that while it's there, but actually getting people to think about how they can do that even in the smallest way is very useful and important in this context. The other thing I think that might be missing in our own work in general is, and it's come out very strongly because of the makeup of our group, who are experiencing a certain amount, some who are experiencing a certain, as staff and students, certain kinds of racism and the effects and the hurt of a far-right rhetoric. So I think we need to look more at that, and I think we could talk a lot about the reasons why this isn't stronger within our research sector. I'm not saying it's not there, but because of the history of the way we've been funded and stuff, then I think it needs to kind of get more center stage. I think it's just an area that's come up for us that's kind of missing, or I don't think it is now. So I suppose the avoidance of politicization leading to, yeah, I won't go into that. So
30 seconds, Gertrude.
Okay, so all of that, and I suppose just to say, if we're breaking the silence, I feel that we need slow bottom-up approaches. We need to amplify marginalized voices, and we need to challenge the status quo. And I suppose I'm asking then, what role will we play collectively in dismantling these silences? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gertrude, and my apologies for cutting you off there. Wonderful, thought-provoking ideas for us to consider, silences and hopes for our GCE practice. I would now like to introduce and invite Miriam to share her slides for her input. It's terrible being the taskmaster on these things. I should have avoided this job. It doesn't suit me. Thank you, Miriam.
Hello. My name is Miriam. I work for a German NGO which is called FINEP, and this is part of the DeFi project, and the DeFi project is what I will present to you today. The DeFi project is a project of Stand, Karloff, Savod Volontariat, and FINEP in Ireland, Germany, and Slovenia. And we are thinking about what education looks like in times of collapse, and we are exploring the capacity of educators to hold space for difficult knowledge and discomfort in learning spaces. And there is a strong and inspiring community of researchers, educators, activists who explore these questions and who we strongly rely on. And one I can mention here is the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective and the work of Vanessa Andreotti, because she introduced me to the image of depth education as a form of education which is like diving into a freezing ocean and instead of looking at mastery education, which is described as climbing a peak and climbing until you reach the top. And so what is needed in times of collapse maybe is this depth education. And I must say that I'm drawn very much to the mountain because I like superhero movies. And so the idea is to be strong and to know a lot. And if you perfect your skill, you can overcome anything. And so depth education to me is a challenge, an ongoing challenge, because it invites instead to accept weaknesses, to accept complicity, to look at shadows, and to dive as deep as you are able to do, and then try some more. And one important aspect we are looking at in our project are emotions and feelings. And studies have shown that young people feel fear and anxiety, grief, shame, defensiveness, guilt, apathy. And the question is, do we work with these feelings in our education settings, in our learning spaces? And we would say that this is a question of capacity of us, if we can look at our own emotions, our own complexities, and our own complicities. And we asked educators to share their thoughts and reflections on this, and we talked about elephants in the room with them. And they shared a lot of thoughts and reflections with us, which we compiled into a zine. And this shows that DeFi is a collective inquiry. And one quote by Michel Fine, which has accompanied me, is that we carve out delicate spaces for fragile solidarities and collective inquiries, and even more valid research, where we might join with others to collectively ignite the slow fuse of possibility, which I really like. And this question that we are thinking about, how we might generate more capacity for difficult knowledge and discomfort in us as educators. We asked the educators that we spoke to last year also, and one quote that has been shared is that one educator said, "We're at this point where it's uncomfortable to ignore and to not talk about the feelings, but then it's also uncomfortable to go there as well. There's a different but almost riskier situation of not going there, of not asking the difficult questions." And so that's what we're trying to do. And that's what we are inviting others to join us and to see what might come out of it. And so next year, we are starting a journey with educators that we call Shifting Edges. And we already have many people who joined us and who want to dive into the difficult knowledge and discomfort with us. And I can share as well that DeFi for me has been very influential on very different aspects of my life. And but there have also been cracks and challenges in the project. And we continuously face these questions about, are we the right ones to talk about this? Do we have the capacity to lead this project? And I am so thankful to my colleagues. One of them is here today as well, Charlotte from Stand, and there's Sai from COLAB and Maya from Savage Volontariat. And I really make this journey with them, and it's so wonderful and inspiring. And yeah, that's a great thing. And one crack and challenge is to actually translate this project into my own language, because I have been exploring DeFi in English, and then I tried to translate it into German and to publish and promote the DeFi project, which is really difficult. And I found that I am more comfortable speaking in English about it. So you can see this in our number of participants in the DeFi project, which is very strong on the Irish side, but then Germany and Slovenia have been less. We have been able to invite less people in, which is also one question of translation, maybe more, but one is the translation, which I find difficult. And so it is an ongoing challenge and a journey. And I am very thankful for having the possibility to present it today and looking forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I will invite Maria to share her slides for our final PechaKucha input. Miriam, thank you so much for, I suppose, bringing together a strand that has been reflected across so many of our inputs today, which is, you know, learning to sit in that difficult space and sit with ourselves and the emotional aspect of the work that we engage with. So thank you for that. Maria, whenever you're ready, you can share. Thank you, Maria.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see that?
We can indeed.
Lovely. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm just listening. My temptation is always to kind of begin to make connections between what everybody else has said. But yes, with 5 minutes and 5 slides, I'm going to refrain from that for now. But it's lovely to be here and to be amongst old friends and new friends. So my name is Maria Barry, and at the moment I'm working in Dublin City University as an assistant professor in history education and global citizenship education. And today I'm here to represent a big group of people that are currently involved in Global Village. So Global Village is a strategic partnership for global citizenship education in primary schools in Ireland. It's 3 years old-ish this year, 2 years, 2.5. And it's a partnership between Irish Aid and a consortium of 4 partners that includes Dublin City University, the Irish National Teachers Organisation, so the trade union for primary school teachers, the Irish Primary Principals Network, and Trócaire. And when we came together, even before we were an official consortium or even before we were a Global Village, one of the commitments that we had as a group, as partners, was to undertake and draw upon research to inform Global Village, to inform its professional development supports that we would offer to primary school teachers and leaders, but also, I suppose, to kind of shape relevant policy at national and international level. So to create that enabling policy environment for the schools. So today I'm going to give you just a very brief insight into the first piece of research that we undertook for Global Village in 2022. So I suppose research often starts with a question or a problem. And in the case of Global Village, when we were conducting our pilot phase, we wanted to establish a more rigorous view of global citizenship education and teachers. So a team of researchers here in DCU, so myself, Ben Mallon, Aisling Burke, Joe Usher and Anna Daly, we carried out a mixed method study of primary school teachers and leaders' values, attitudes, practices related to GCE. And we used an online survey that was sent to every primary school in the country. And the key questions that underpinned the study were, what are teachers, including primary school teachers, including school leaders' understandings of GCE? What are their knowledge and attitudes towards GCE? How would they rate their confidence and skills? And according to both teachers and school leaders, what impacts on the inclusion of global citizenship education in their schools? So I think in research as well, it's always really important when we're reading the findings to actually also know, well, who have we drawn on to present these findings? So who were the participants in the study? And we started out very ambitiously, wanting to get 1,000 teachers to answer our online survey. But I suppose it was a real struggle, to be perfectly honest with you, despite having, you know, the INTO, the Irish Primary Principals Network, and having sent out the survey to all schools. So we had to try a number of different strategies to try and recruit as many. We kind of moved then to wanting 500, and in the end, we had a total of 288 participants, which is still the kind of, you know, biggest number of primary school teachers to be surveyed in Ireland. And we were just under the 10% to be kind of representative. So if we look then at the kind of demographics of the participants, so who are they? What types of primary school teachers? I mean, there's something like 40,000 primary school teachers in the country. So who are this group that are included in the survey? Actually, when we look at them overall, they're quite an experienced bunch. So the majority of the respondents had 11 years plus teaching experience. So 65% of them were quite experienced, but we also had a good cohort of newly qualified teachers, so NQTs. So 20% of the respondents represented that. And actually quite a lot of them, I don't have the statistic here, but the vast majority of them said that in their time teaching, they had experienced teaching all levels of primary, from infants right up to 6th class. We also had significant kind of school leadership respondents. So just under kind of 45%, I think, had a school leadership position. And interestingly, actually, we felt quite a high number had participated in some type of global citizenship education, continuous professional development in the past. The majority hadn't. And I suppose this might be particularly interesting to those of you who, like Global Village, are offering or considering offering professional development opportunities for primary school teachers. We also asked them about the time that they spent, and this was definitely a question we'd ask differently. I think as all researchers as well, we experienced that. So interesting learnings there. So what can we tell from what they reported? So a significant portion said that they spent an hour teaching GCE, approximately an average an hour teaching GCE. But however, quite a lot were unable to quantify how much time they spent teaching GCE. And that's interesting. And it may come through in things like what they said about the curriculum. And if you want more details on the kind of respondents of the survey, they're available in the full report, and I've included a link to that at the end. So this slide just presents you with a few key findings. And I suppose, what does research do? Sometimes it confirms what we know anecdotally. Okay, so research, applies this rigorous, it's not objective, right? But it's rigorous, it's systematic, and it gives us maybe a broader view as well, this study, seeing as it did include quite a large number of teachers. So overall, actually, there was very high rating of importance to GCE or of GCE to children's learning amongst primary school teachers. So very strong support for it, for children, and the importance of it, and a very broad, not surprising, multi-dimensional understandings of GCE that did have quite a strong, what we might say, cosmopolitan outlook. So a lot of talk about shared humanity, interconnectedness, interdependence. Really interestingly, when we asked teachers, it was an open-ended question on teachers' understandings of GCE. And really interesting, there was not as much reference to rights or sustainability or climate change in teachers' kind of open-ended responses to their understandings of GCE. And then also when we looked across their definitions or their understandings, and we rated them against UNESCO's core pillars of cognitive, socio-emotional and behavioural, there was less reference to or less connection in teachers' understandings of GCE to action or behavioural dimensions. And then when we asked them to rate their confidence across a number of different types of pedagogical skills, they would have rated their confidence to enable children to take action as lower than, for example, helping children to develop a sense of empathy. So that's something that I think is really interesting for the sector as well. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, time came up as the most significant obstacle that teachers identified. And when we drilled down into that, we asked them again for an open-ended response to that. Sometimes they just said time as a word, and sometimes they talked about insufficient time for planning and preparedness, no discrete curriculum time they talked about, and then maybe a lack of time for whole school planning and collaboration. So that's maybe useful as well to help us kind of unpick that concept of time. Curriculum was rated as a factor as well. And then when we looked at that, there was curriculum overload was mentioned, a lack of discrete curriculum time, but also actually perceived curriculum strength. So we see this in education, a narrowing of the curriculum. So actually the primary curriculum is very open and flexible and quite progressive. It is under review, but actually what we see is this narrowing of the curriculum to actually then what happens in the classroom. So the Global Village team have taken these findings and they're using it in their work. So for example, when they meet with teachers, when they meet with school leaders for professional development or at conferences, we're making efforts to make explicit connections between GCE, human rights education, and education for sustainable development. And we also did that in our response to the primary curriculum consultations as well. And then when Global Village offers whole school approaches workshops for schools, we begin now with the reflection on getting the staff to think about, well, what is currently existing within their practice, within their school, that could be linked to GCE. So actually helping schools and teachers to recognise all that they're doing and to understand it maybe through a lens of GCE that can be enhanced, that can be maybe made more coherent, but certainly that teachers have an opportunity to recognise the contributions that they're already making to children's sense of global citizenship.
Maria, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to finish up.
That's it. This is the slide with the links. So I've shared the slides with Anya if you want further information.
Thank you so much, Maria. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much, everyone. There's a lot of food for thought, and I know a lot of our participants shared the same thing in the chat. We did want to make this space for you to react, reflect, share your comments, your thoughts on anything that you've heard from Pecha Kucha. We have about 10 minutes. So I do realize it's a very short turnaround to process and both reflect and both see what it is you want to share with all the researchers that you hear. But yes, I do invite you in the next 10 minutes to make this space into a conversation. This is your chance to ask your questions. We will have a wider conversation after this again, but I know myself, I have some very specific questions I'd like to ask all of our presenters. So I might start with something actually I did receive from one of our speakers. Apologies, I received from one of our participants to one of our speakers, and it's directed at Miriam. Someone was wondering, firstly, they added that they love the illustrations for the e-zine, and they were wondering if their use is part of your research methodology. They think it's great to see such creative approaches, but we were wondering if you can speak more about how the e-zine fits with the research, and if it, I suppose my addition to this question, if that's a byproduct, or did you always set out to have this kind of creative output as part of your project?
I would say that we always meant to work like this because it's about emotion and feeling, and because only talking on a very like theoretical level about your emotions and not experiencing them is different. And so we are trying also to work with our body and really feel into what it makes, what it does to us to feel those feelings and what it changes in our body. And so the creative approach is one way of actually dealing with and getting it out there. But maybe also Charlotte has something additional to say, because she's also here and she has done great work on the zine.
Maybe nothing hugely more to add. Like maybe just from a personal space. Maybe the discussion in the DeFi team was about how to present this research, and were we going to take a theoretical approach to it and give some sort of meta insight into the reflections and quotes that came in, or would we just leave it at that? So aside from a 2 or 3 pager at the beginning of the zine that sort of gives a little bit of a literature review and an explanation as to what DeFi is, you'll see if you engage with the zine, it really is just, I should remove the word just there because it's incredibly powerful. The quotes and thoughts that came in from educators from Ireland, Slovenia and Germany through a sort of journaling seminar that we did online that maybe some of you attended. And then also online conversation circles that we did. And I suppose we imagine that any analysis, if you want, might come again from reflection by maybe those same educators who take part in the shifting edges. And from that, another piece then emerges, a workbook or a handbook or however you want to call it. Yeah, That would be my answer to it.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I do like, and someone seconded it, a comment, I suppose, to everything you're saying, both Charlotte and Miriam, is that this holistic approach, I suppose, in acknowledging and giving more space and voice to emotions is so important in our line of work, because it does drive action, both action and non-action. I thought that comment really well fitted in everything that both of you said. I suppose I have a question myself for Gertrude, and I know a lot of our participants would second the fact that we thought your contribution are just so important, and often the conversation we're not having. So my question for you, Gertrude, is, and I'm going to throw back to some extent the question that you asked us at the end back at you. So the question was, what role will we play collectively in dismantling these silences? So my question is twofold. What role, is there anything we can learn from you in terms of the role you have played? Has it been challenging? And if so, what are the challenges you see or have seen by playing that role in challenging those silences? Are they structural? Are they practical? Are we talking about time? Are we talking about capacity? Are we just not equipped with the skills and the knowledge that is needed at the moment to challenge those silences? So it's a very, very large question.
If I had the answer to those questions, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. The challenges are immense. I mean, it's interesting sometimes when you listen to, community, and you're listening, inputs from community and primary school and secondary school, that actually the challenges are often the same, and definitely time. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt at all, but in terms of third level educators, time is the biggest problem. Well, it's not the biggest, it's from a personal point of view, from the individual point of view, that's a huge issue. With all the interest and kind of goodwill in the world and learning, time is a huge issue for all of us. There are institutional challenges. I think the whole thing about institutional is very interesting, because we can challenge the institution, and we can even get places, and we are getting places. And I've been asked now, for example, to have a strong input to the policy on global citizenship education for UCC. I mean, a very strong influence, because our work is kind of finally getting properly recognized. However, at the same time, what often happens at a national level, at a university level, even at a school level, at an international level, sometimes things get very diluted if you get to a place where you're impacting whole institutions. Because so I think that even in our own sector, as you put in more as things get more professional, and as we don't have enough resources to go around in terms of what we want to do, things can get a bit diluted. Even the whole concept of kind of integration can mean that people are having bits of this and bits of that. So I think there's kind of room for both. So what I'm saying, I think, is that you need to have both. I think you need to have it's not that I'm saying we won't have an impact on the institution, we have to, but we're never going to, well, I won't say we'll never, but it's a long road ahead, as in probably another 100 years before you get institutions to really being where we want them to be. You can do your very best, but trust me, in a way, if if your universities are like ours, so I think we need to also have our own spaces. We need to have our own specialisms as well as the integration. We need to really, really keep to our basics, keep to our social justice aspects, to our human rights aspects, to our decolonialism and all of that. And we have to I could talk about this forever, and I'm going to stop now. But while there are institutional challenges, there are opportunities. At the same time, we need to be very careful when we're dealing with the institution. And we need to also maintain our own spaces, our own networks, our own criticality. I think that's what I'm going to say about that. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but that's what I'm saying anyway.
It is. And I think I find it interesting, but not surprising, I suppose, of how it connects to everything else we've heard on, I think there's such a variety in the research that we saw today, and variety in the speakers and backgrounds, and yet there does seem to be a common thread in terms of the reflection piece and how much we need to know ourselves and our own practice before we can influence the world, I suppose, world. I'll hand it over to Lee, who has a question.
Thank you, Anya. So first to say thanks to everyone who has presented so far. It's really thought-provoking and fascinating to hear the different pieces of research. I have a question that's related to the DeFi project, and I don't only want to address it to Miriam or Charlotte, but kind of open it up because it's a broader question I have about the value of bringing in, so it's not even related specifically to research, but more to practice that can then be researched, observed. The value of maybe bringing in psychologists or people who are trained to actually help others manage and navigate emotions, or, you know, in a space, in a group, into the educational setting. So like with the educators, so that it's a kind of a, or else broadening the capacity or the expertise of the educators to have that capacity, like from like professionally. It seems like it is a missing ingredient, you know, to like to be able to get to behavior change or transformation, that you can't go over the emotions. And it reminds me of the quote I have on my email from Frary, that education is about addressing emotions. Like, you can't skip that. So that's my question.
Thank you.
So Miriam,
Yeah,
or anyone else on the call that's an educator that would like to talk?
Anyone in particular want to address that question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give one response.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it's it's an important question, Lee. And I think multidisciplinary teams for research in general is a good idea. And so like one of the people that was on our survey team, Aisling Burke, a colleague, she's an educational psychologist. So not only does she have that kind of attitudinal, behavioral psychology background, but she's also a statistician. Which I am not. I am definitely qualitative research, yeah. So I think the notion of team, I mean, you know, I think, you know, the sector in Ireland, GCE, is built on community, built on partnerships, built on connections. You know, teams like Global Village and others who have your teachers, representatives, you have your academics, those involved in teacher education. So absolutely, I agree with you on that. I think it's really rich and it adds depth to studies. I would also say specifically in relation to emotions, that actually my colleague Rowan Oberman, and I can share the article with you, she did research with primary school children on emotions connected to climate change and the use of picture books. And actually what she found is that, and actually there are other studies to show that actually the strongest negative emotions that young people have about school relates to exams, not to climate change or crises. And actually what Rowan's study shows actually that it's, as educators, it's all about how you do something, right? So a bit like Miriam was talking about, like the types of research that we conduct and how we conduct research, if it's sensitive or is really important. So drawing on different creative approaches. But anyway, Rowan's article is, I think it's really fascinating because it shows actually that if you engage with climate change or crises through picture books, at times it can be enjoyable, pleasant, because the story carries us, the imagery, the illustrations, and actually that the concern and the anxiety amongst children and young people is because, you know, they feel like they're not doing anything, or they're not learning about it, or they're not hearing about it in school. It's not being addressed. So when we do climate change education, it can be empowering and it can be a positive emotional experience, if that makes sense. So I think there's lots of interesting research around this, and I would point to Rowan's as one. Yeah.
That's brilliant, Maria. Absolutely. Please do share, and we will share any link that you colleagues and participants shared today in the email, in the follow-up email. I want to hand it over very quickly back to Maximiliana and then Miriam. We want to head off to a break soon, but yeah, if you want to address that, Maximiliana.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I want to talk a little bit about the question that Lee asks. I think that is an important question, to be honest. And I'm answering this question with from my own experience. It's not from research, but from my own experience with emotions. Because within the sector, we are dealing with very heavy topics. For example, the topics of dealing with racism, topics dealing with colonialism, topics dealing with poverty and the like. So there is a need to have that regulations and management of emotions sometimes as well. So Lee is saying that we should bring psychologists, and I thought that was very important because sometimes the emotions can be very heavy, and also heavy and heavier that they are, but they are very important to sit down with them, like to sit within the discomforts of the emotions so that we can navigate solutions. So that we can get solution from those kind of emotions. So I think from my own experience, management is very important of the emotions, because especially because when you speak of emotions, there are positive emotions and negative emotions, and they're both important, because it's from anger, for example, is where we get the urge to deal with problems or to find solutions. And also it's from happiness where we get excited and do more about what we do best within the sector. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maximiliana. I couldn't agree more, especially given all the work recently we have been doing, like you mentioned, on racial justice and those spaces. We learn how important it is to sit with these emotions, but are we equipped to do it ourselves before we even ask it of our audiences? And yeah, Miriam, if you want to add anything before we head on a break, please.
Yes, what I wanted to add very briefly is that we talked about this question as well, and I find using the findings of psychology very, very important, but then also to think about what our education learning spaces are not, and to really think about what the difference might be between education and therapy as well, and what we aim at with our spaces that we create. And the creation and facilitation of those spaces are very, very important to us. And we think a lot about those questions, how to facilitate, how to make the space so that emotions are welcome and are held in that space. So that would be my brief answer.
I might throw open the first question to our panelists. I suppose building on what we've heard today and what you've heard from each other, and we've had some phenomenal engagement through the chat as well, what would you see as priority areas for GCE research into the future? And Karen, I might bring your voice back in maybe to start on this one.
Thanks, Joanne. Pardon me, thanks to everybody. Those very quick but deep inputs have still got my brain thinking. I think one thing I might think is a priority that seems to have come up and is something I've been working on with my work with teachers is these intersections of critical global citizenship education and environmental and sustainability education. From what Maria's saying, from the depth education, from what's inspiring young people, and and also looking at what we've been doing in universities. So there's a huge greenwashing situation coming in right now, and I think we as critical global citizenship educators have something to offer there at the same time that we're think through depth education and the ways that we're also make sure that we're keeping track of ourselves and being self-reflexive. But to me that's a priority area.
Thank you, Karen. Really appreciate that. Would any of our other panelists like to contribute there in terms of priority areas?
I mean, I can come in there. I mean, there are many priority areas, I suppose, really, that you could look at. I mean, I know this sounds very simple, but I actually think that keeping to the basics is our priority. Keeping to our central who we are, really, that criticality, that not losing that, actually, because it's very easy to lose it. And it doesn't matter what methodology you're using or what, well, it does, but you know what I mean? It doesn't matter what, a lot of things don't matter if you don't keep to the basics, because it can easily, very easily be taken away from you and usurped. Our language can be usurped, our thinking can be usurped, and we have to be very intentional, as I think Laura said in the chat there. I think that's a very good word, kind of intentional. And while it sounds very basic, often it comes back to that, I think, keeping that at the center all the time. The other thing I think that is important, well, I suppose it struck me that what's important for you might be important for us, but we have identified that kind of partnership as a thing that has emerged for us as a community of people, but that mightn't be the case somewhere else. But it is important to kind of, you know, go with the energy of the people that you're trying to work with. There's no point in working with somebody else's energy. So what works in one place mightn't work in another. Yeah, I think there are two things. I mean, there's many priorities. I think keeping our voice, though, while the SDGs and so on are an opportunity, I think keeping the global, critical global justice education voice in its own right, kind of, is very, very important. So I think we have to be very careful how we manage that.
Thanks, Gertrude. Appreciate that. Any other panel member like to contribute to that question?
Yeah, I agree with what Karen and Gertrude have said. And I thought Gertrude put it well, actually, when she was presenting as well, about holding true whilst at the same time working at that kind of wider institutional policy level. I mean, I think for me, one of the things is about trying to make research accessible and acting on research as well. So sometimes I'd love to put a moratorium on all new studies and just take time for everybody to actually take what's already there and known, and see how we can apply it. So this is a really welcome space, I think. I think we were all captivated by kind of Defy's approach and that creative output. And yeah, even for us here, trying to make kind of those research projects that we're involved in, like, to make them accessible for the student teacher body, and for other groups in society, you know, as well. So I think spaces like this where we're sharing research, sharing knowledge, and ensuring that it's accessible so that people can participate in research studies, but also so that they can access research outputs as well.
I think that's a wonderful point, well made, Maria. Not only is research held behind paywalls, but I think Miriam alluded to it in her Pechakucha when she talked about the intentional decision making around how the research outputs would be shared through the zine. And I actually was very taken by that in terms of accessibility. Maximiliana.
Oh, thank you so much. I think Maria almost preempted me because I wanted to talk about the terminologies that we used in GCE. So we have to also make sure that the priority is to make the research simple for people to understand, because I've read a few of the research work that is out there, and sometimes you get lost into terminologies. So I think it's very important for us, the researchers, to prioritize making it very accessible for everyone to be able to access it and understand it, and so that they can put it into practice. But another thing that I want to talk about is like collaborative learning. They say, is it bottom up approach? Yeah, something like that. Maybe we can allow more students to tell us more about their experience with the world, and then for teachers to also advise. So not to expect for teachers to have everything or to have every answer of the topics that they're discussing about with regards to global issues, but also to let the students talk about the issues and to navigate more about these issues, because they know things. Nowadays, young people know a lot of things than we can ever imagine. So I think we should allow that kind of collaborative learning to, to be a priority in the sector. I think that's all I can say. Thank you.
I think that's another wonderful point, Maximiliana, about capturing the learner voice. And that actually came up in the breakout room that I was with as well, with colleagues from VSI, in terms of sometimes we have to be mindful that those that, you know, choose to engage in research with us may have particular dispositions that, you know, and positions that we welcome. But it's also about accessing those that do not choose to engage with us and ensuring that we capture and invite, even if the voices are either marginalized or that they're different maybe to mainstream. That's an interesting aspect as well. Anybody from the floor wish to pose a question to any member of our panelists? Oh, Aidan, you're very welcome, Aidan.
Thank you. Just following up and going off on a slight tangent, maybe with what Gertrude was talking about, which was keeping to the basics. And one basic question I maybe have often asked, and maybe I'm in danger of repeating myself, is do we have a shared, or can we have a shared understanding, even an approximation to what we understand of what education is as the fundamental premise? Because there's lots of ways of looking at it. We could be looking at it even from a global citizenship point of view as an instrument for global citizenship education. But is that what it is? Or is there another more fundamental way of looking at what education is and then building our thing on top of that? So I don't know, has there ever been a real good in-depth exploration of our understanding of education itself before we go into the other spaces? And hopefully it isn't purely an instrument for economic purposes, nor should it be an instrument maybe exclusively for change purpose. I mean, there are other ways of looking at it, and that's why I'm just raising the idea of can we explore that?
That's a wonderful question, and thank you, Aidan. So we go from Maximiliana's point of including and inviting the learner voice, and then you take us to that macro level, Aidan, of, questioning and even approximation of a shared understanding and purpose of education for GCE. Any one of our panelists like to chat to Aidan about that?
I would if I could.
We hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I can't work this thing. That's a big question. I always ask both staff and students when I'm working with them. One of the first questions is, what is education? And look, I mean, if there's 50 people in the room, you're going to get 50 people different answers. So I think, in fairness, I think that there are some basic principles of what we're about. I mean, I think there are some common understandings, and I do think you have to have some kind of level of common language. We are not talking, when we're talking about, we're not talking, our area is not profit making, for example. It's, we know what we want to see in the world. So, I mean, sorry, this is just very disconcerting because I can't see anybody. So yeah, I mean, the answer, I think, is I do think that we need some common principles, but I do actually think that we kind of have, I think there's a lot of, general agreement. I don't think it has to be exactly the same for everybody. I would have very strong views on some of the definitions that we're using, but at the same time, there are some basic tenets and principles and underlying kind of knowledges that I think we do kind of agree on. So I don't know, like, I think we know as a group of people, like, what we're about, all right. But like, everybody will have a different understanding of what education is. But all we can do is talk about what our understanding of education is. Like, as a whatever you call it, as an activist, an academic kind of tradition.
Thank you, Gertrude. Anyone else like to engage with Aidan on that question? Miriam?
I would say not specifically on that question, but in a broader sense, in the sense of reflection always being a way forward. And that's what we also try to encourage, to say, if we reflect on our practice and what we as a group, for example, think of the concept of education, but also all the concepts Karen Pashby was talking about this morning. If you, for example, in my organization, it's a civil society organization, we have an educational team. And I would love to have more conversation, more reflection, more research, applicability, and continually take the time to have a reflective process. So that would be my answer, or
Thank you.
the
Thank
journey
you.
ahead.
Yes, indeed. And I suppose even from my own perspective, and Lee, I know, has her hand up here, and as the policy lead for IDEA, she will attest to this, no doubt. But I suppose consulting with policy developments is key, a key area in terms of, I suppose, an explicit shared understanding, an explicit articulation of those key tenets that you spoke about, Gertrude. And Maximiliana.
Sorry, Aidan's question is very interesting because I couldn't stop but thinking that the definition of education is gradually changing. The concept of education, I mean, is gradually changing. That's why we have GCE nowadays, and we are striving for it to even being integrated into education curriculum, because the education that we thought maybe was education, maybe it needs more. So I feel like if we will sit down and say this is the definition of education, it means you are going to miss out point after 20 years, maybe 20 years to come. So I feel like we are the product of evolution as human species. So that's the education. It's going to evolve. It's going to change. So I think even GC itself, maybe 20 years to come, is going to also evolve and change to match the time that will be, you know, in the future time. So that's my own understanding of Aidan's question. Maybe I didn't get it right, but I feel like evolution is the key here. Thank you.
I think, no, you're spot on, Maximiliana. And I'm also drawn to a comment that Gertrude included in the comments section on the chat function, which was, we also have to be considerate that we can't be all things to all people. So I'm going to throw that in there as a facet as well. I'm going to leave the last word on this one to you, Maria, and then I'm going to head to Lee for a question.
Well, I don't know about, I suppose I was thinking about this space and Aidan's question about defining education. And I know Aidan has always been a strong proponent of like education being a lifelong process. And I think when it comes to global citizenship education, we have to take that viewpoint, because I think if I think, you know, primary school teachers have to do it all, then it's just impossible and overwhelming. And probably I think IDEA is great to bring us together, and I've learned a lot from colleagues from different sectors over the years, but maybe it's something we could kind of even strengthen further, you know, to think that actually I'm not responsible for this learner, this student teacher in front of me today at 9 o'clock, you know, that there are other avenues and other ways and other interactions and other educations that they will have that can contribute to this. And I think that's really important and essential. So I think it absolutely needs to be protected. And maybe it's something that we can maybe lean on a bit more or explore. It might be another space for research or something, you know. But so this kind of, you know, education not just being formal education in the first instance, I suppose, and it also being lifelong from early years right up. Yeah.
That's a great point, Maria, because we have, you know, our seminal legislation, including the Education Act, for example, that determines the compromise and constitute parts of formal education. But as Maximiliana pointed out, everything is evolving. Larissa just included one really interesting comment to close this piece out in the chat and suggested maybe we can't ask what is education before asking what is education for, and the purpose, and deconstructing the concept from there. So Lee, over to you maybe for another question for our panel.
Thanks so much, Joanne. And yeah, this question, Karen already responded in the chat. And it's not the first time also that Karen has heard this question from me, because we were in another space with Bridge 47 a couple of weeks ago, where I posed more or less the same question about, like, I suppose that when I engage with policymakers, are those that hold the purse strings to fund GCE, a question that I have come across is, well, you know, what's the impact of it? And so far in my role, I've been in this role now, I think 7 months, I haven't found like a one go-to, you know, site where I can draw on all this research that demonstrates the impact of GCE. So it was, I suppose that would be a priority, like a selfish priority for my role, to be able to convince policymakers to increase investment, and other people in my type of role, of course, to be convincing policymakers to invest more in this. So yeah, that would be my the impact of GCA demonstrated the positive impact it's having in the lives of the learners, but also the multiplier effect. And I suppose, speaking to the challenges of that type of research, I know already I am envisaging something like longitudinal, and not necessarily that fits within the parameters of this neoliberal approach of inputs, outputs. Like, okay, we gave this input, now what is the output? But more that, yeah, longitudinal and qualitative research approach.
Thanks, Lee. And I think that's a quintessential question for every member in the sector, and maybe aligns quite beautifully with Aidan's ongoing question of the purpose of education, and the fact, do we have a shared understanding of that purpose, and maybe even to narrow it in terms of the shared purpose of GCE. Would anyone like on the panel like to respond to Lee's question about measurement and impact? Karen, go for it.
Thanks, Lee. And I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I'm always linking to that our shared world document, because they really gave it a go. Doug and Jenny did a really good job trying to find the evidence, and I think it's quite tricky. And actually, this whole idea of this space, and I really loved that idea. And Maria, I completely understand what you mean, how you feel, because we lump a lot onto teachers. We're also lumping a lot onto educators, education researchers, we're lumping a lot onto NGO workers. So what I think we need to do is recognize how we can all add our own unique pieces to the puzzle, because sometimes I feel like as a researcher, I totally agree that we need to make things accessible. And actually in education research, I don't think that's such a huge problem. Most of us are educators, but people also have to engage with the research, right? It's not research if I've already decided what the outcome's going to be and what impact it's going to have on policy. To me, that's just back to what's education, back to what's research. But I really like that idea, Lee, of the longitudinal, because I'll be completely honest with you, we don't get funding that can allow us to look at the impact on learners properly. We don't get funding that takes long enough. We're even in like proper universities, we still have a precarity issue, and it's even worse, of course, in the NGO sector. And it's also ethics, because actually doing proper, good research with young people over time is really ethically complex. So I think that's exactly what we need. And I'll just end with one little anecdote. I used to teach a class at the university called International Development, Education, and Colonialism. And students were quite challenged, lots of critical GCE stuff. And they did an assignment and it got marked. But you know what happens? Every year around this time of year, I get emails from former students saying, I just heard, do they know it's Christmas? And thought of you, and told the person beside me, did you know this is actually really problematic? And that's not captured in their mark, right? So a lot of the work we do isn't about the assignment. It's not even something we'll be able to find out just with an exit questionnaire. So I think you're onto something about the longitudinal, and I think that maybe could be its own thing for us to work on about how we can each contribute to that. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded response.
Thank you, Karen. Anyone else like to engage with Lee about impact measurement? Go for it, Gertrude.
No, I mean, yes, of course, longitudinal is important, and all the reasons you gave around funding and so on, but also those shorter projects and research projects are very important to engage new people as well. For example, we find well, I mean, I found really without a shadow of doubt the creative arts, like our Elephant in the Room project at the moment, or our mystery box. And we're writing resources about all of these. But when you also combine that with research, you get people in a different way. You talked about emotion. Well, you get people in from an emotional point, but just a way being able to facilitate that properly. Like my job is to kind of engage other people, and we're not always talking to the converted, and mostly I'm not actually. So when you need to know what the currency is, and I know that sounds a little bit neoliberal in itself, but I mean the thing is, we have to engage people where they're at, and they're not going to launch into a big longitudinal study. I mean that's important, but I'm just kind of saying that the shorter creative, for example, but shorter projects are also important. There's horses for courses, I suppose is what I'm saying. I wouldn't be throwing out the whatever it is. I wouldn't be they're both important for different reasons. People, at certain stages of their career, and third level where I am, they need to do certain things, and I know we can challenge that, but there's a reality there as well that you need to take people where they're at, and then hope in the long term that the kind of ideas we're interested in will sink in. But you're not starting there. So it takes time, I think. So I'm just advocating for both, really, I think, short-term and long-term research.
Thank you, Gertrude. Yeah, and I think the piece that you brought, read the creative arts, is really important as well. There's some lovely comments coming up in the chat, Anya, that I'm just going to flag with all of our participants if you aren't engaging with them. Philomena earlier related to exactly your point, I think, Gertrude, around, a multiplicity of resources, and that aligns with Miriam's point as well, that are appropriate and age appropriate across the age span of our learners. My lovely colleague Deirdre Hogan put in a really nice comment where she talked about the kind of common thread that was across so many of our inputs today that highlight the importance of us protecting the spaces that allow us to slow down, to think, to reflect, acknowledge emotions and self-awareness potentially, and to take on board the theoretical underpinning and the research that has been produced. And there is a lot of research in this space, and the conversations then from events like today that provide food for thought. Another lovely comment that came through as well was around the work that IDEA is currently doing on the theory for change, which some of you may be aware of, just to flag that. And then one last one that Philomena shared was a final year exam question, and this relates to Aidan's question that she got in college 40 years ago. Education is the ability to coexist, discuss. And with that, Anya, I think I'll hand back over to you. And I'm very sorry if anyone didn't get the opportunity to engage. You shall have the contact details of our participants. We will also share the resources that they have used to support their inputs today with all of you, so that hopefully they will act as a resource as well. I'll hand back over to you, Anya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you so much, everything, for joining us today. Yes, just to echo on the theory of change piece, and just because it just feeds so nicely to everything that was discussed there in terms of impact. I think, like Karen said, there's a risk as well, I think. Sorry, I know it's not my time to do an intervention, but it's just a piece of work that I think all of our members and all the people engaged here today will be very interested in discovering. We're at the very early stages. The task group is just working on a draft that will be piloting, reviewing, trying to share more internationally, and we'd love for research practitioners to engage in this piece of work, because I think it's really, really important, because it answers Aidan's question and Larissa's comment. We can't really look at our impact if we've never agreed on what that impact wants to look like, and we've never agreed what kind of measurement, I suppose, we can look like. I think what Karen mentioned are exceptional examples of the impact we have, but until we have the definition to, I suppose, back the fact that this is evidence because this is what we're trying to achieve, it's very hard to have that conversation. I think there's too much room for misunderstanding before we can engage in such a big piece of research, even before we look at all the logistical, I suppose, challenges of the longitudinal research. So that's just with my idea hat and all the work that we're doing in impact. If any of participants here today or research would like to engage in this piece of work, we really do welcome any potential for growing numbers on this piece of work. We will also be sharing a report, like I mentioned, with the main highlights and findings from this research showcase, but also the one we had last year. I think there's a lot of really interesting points that were made last year that could feed onto your reflection today. We also have the wonderful work that Leah did today that hopefully we'll be able to share with you then. So again, the last thing left to do for me is to thank everyone, all of my colleagues, the wonderful colleagues in Ubuntu, my colleagues in IDEA, but also all the panelists and people who work to make this event possible. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your time and your commitment to this event and everything you've contributed to it. Yes, so thank you so much, and enjoy your lunch and enjoy your week. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.